Thanks for joining today's webinar on Performance Testing Bootcamp with JMeter and Taurus. My name is Zofia Prusa. I'm from the New York City office of BlazeMeter. We have a lot to cover today, so let's jump right in. I will say before we get started that today's session will be recorded, so we'll go ahead and send you a link to the recording within 24 hours. And if you have any questions, you can enter them in the GoToWebinar control panel under the questions section. So what are we going to cover today? We'll have just a really high-level quick overview of JMeter and Taurus for those of you who aren't that familiar. We'll get a little into the performance testing story. What is it that we are going to actually be testing today? And then we'll dig right into script recording and debugging, trying to understand how you can do the script recording and debugging. But most importantly, we're going to actually dig down into how to deal with the dynamic parameters, error checking, and CSV data in my script. We'll go over reporting and end with some Q&A. So first of all, what is JMeter? JMeter, it's an open source Apache project. It's used for load testing. It's de facto the most popular open source load testing tool out there today, with a good reason, because there's really nothing it can't test. JMeter is HTTP based in terms of how it actually creates virtual users. So it basically makes HTTP requests. Some terminology that you might see in JMeter are threads is a user, a thread group is a group of users. Ultimately, within JMeter, we create our tests in the GUI, and the execution can either be through the GUI for small loads or for the command line, which is the more common scenario when I'm actually doing real testing. The problem with JMeter is that it doesn't really lend itself well to an agile / DevOps type of environment where you want to be running a lot of tests. You want to be able to basically look at the differences in the different tests that you're running. You want to understand the change flow within the tests. You might want to even combine tests to run together. It's a great tool, but it just doesn't lend itself well to kind of CI type environment. And all the above is kind of hard to do with JMeter, but it's really easy with Taurus. So today we're going to really dig deep into Taurus and show you how everything you're doing within JMeter you can do within Taurus, along with some other cool stuff on top of that. So what is Taurus? Taurus is an open source project. It stands for Test Automation Running Smoothly. It's great for performance testing. It simplifies the automation of performance testing. It makes it easy to create tests. It was built for developers and DevOps, really giving them an easy interface for testing. Under the hood, it utilizes JMeter, Gatling, Grinder as the underlying engines, and it's open source. And you can click at the link at the bottom. It's an active project, which we've been doing for the past few months. What does Taurus provide and what were our goals? So first and foremost, we wanted to give users a human-readable way to actually define the tests. No longer do you have to deal with JMeter's XML files, only within the JMeter GUI. As you'll see in a few seconds, everything is done within simple text files. Additionally, sometimes you might have existing JMeter tests and you just want to modify them by overriding parameters. You can easily do that within Taurus. And last but not least, in terms of reporting, it gives you both built-in analysis and also an easy way to integrate with third parties, specifically as in BlazeMeter. So how does Taurus work from a conceptual perspective? Is that within Taurus, you can create the test scenario and the criteria. Taurus then, on the fly, creates an actual JMeter script. JMeter then makes those HTTP requests. Obviously, those hit your backend website. The website responds with raw responses into JMeter, and then Taurus can use those responses for reporting and analysis. In terms of installing Taurus, it basically installs on Windows, Linux, Macs, anywhere that you have Python or Java. It's just an easy install. And if you want more information, you can go to the installation stuff. So before actually going to a simple example, I want to tell you a little more about Taurus. In terms of the flow that you're going to see, since the JMeter test is created just before running, there is an option at the Taurus command line -GUI, and that opens up the actual JMeter GUI itself and hands over the steering wheel to the developer so you can see what you're doing. Additionally, if you add a -report command line, it will open up a browser and it sends the data over to BlazeMeter in real time to give you real-time performance data. Another thing that I mentioned beforehand is that if you do want to modify existing JMeter scripts, you can do so easily within Taurus. That won't be the focus of today's session, but it's something that you can do. And it makes it easy to override within the Taurus YAML file your JMeter scripts. So let's go ahead and dive right into the demo and understand what we're going to be doing today. So for today's session, the user story is that you own a e-commerce website. In this case, it's this free commerce. This happens to be an open source project for e-commerce. And we want to simulate a user coming to our website, in this case, store.blazedemo.com, clicking on one of the items, let's say the Ruby on Rails tote, and then adding it to the cart. After they've added to the cart, they click on the checkout. I'm going to check out as a guest. After I hit continue, I'm going to fill in some information here. All of this is required. But basically, the person goes through the checkout process. Real phone number. And I hit save and continue. Oh, the zip code. It doesn't like my zip code. Sorry about that. There we go. It gives me a delivery option, some credit card information, save and continue. At the end, we have a confirmation page. I can look over the information. I hit place order. And basically kind of get a thank you page. So this is the website that we want to be testing today. So the first thing that we did when we wanted to create this script is record the user activity. And there's two different ways you can record the user activity. We're not going to go into too much detail about that, but you usually want to start with kind of a skeleton to start with. One way to record user activity is by using BlazeMeter's own Chrome plugin. So let me go ahead and show you how that works really quickly. So here is the same website in Chrome. I've already installed the Chrome plugin. Just do a Google search for BlazeMeter Chrome. I can click on it and hit the start recording, and then I can go through the same process and it will record all the activity and gives me the ability to save it as a JMeter script after the fact. And then I can go in and edit the JMeter script. Alternatively, if you are a JMeter user, or if for whatever reason you prefer to use JMeter's built-in script recorder, you can do so. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like really quickly. Just a second. Just a second, having a bit technical difficulties. Okay, here it is. So here is JMeter, and JMeter has a template. If you click here on the template tab, you have a recording template, and I'll just hit create. And what that does is gives me the ability to basically define JMeter itself as a proxy, which also is a script recorder. And through the proxy, what it'll do is take all the activity and save it as a JMeter script. So that's something which I did beforehand. I can go ahead and do File and Open and show you what that looks like really quick. Here we go, here's raw. And here's what the raw activity looked like. You can see there's a lot of requests here. And the JMeter proxy stored all these requests. So that's how you basically have the raw data. Now, if you were to play this back, or if you were to try to at this point basically use this script, you'd find that there are issues with what's called correlation, or basically dynamic parameters. So very quickly we found while we were doing the script that there's a few authentication mechanisms, a few dynamic tokens that we need to pass from one request to another. So I'm going to actually go ahead and show you how we do that within Taurus, not within JMeter. Here we go. And at the same time, I'm going to go over this Taurus file, because this Taurus file we're looking at, this is the finished product of basically the entire script. Here we go. I'll give you a slightly simpler version. So here you can see within Taurus, I have a lot of different sections. Let's go ahead and actually go over this and understand what we're doing. So within the Taurus, the third thing I've defined is scenarios. And these scenarios you can later use as building blocks for your actual script. So here are scenarios, and the first scenario I defined is a checkout scenario. And if I go to the bottom of the script, I can see under the execution, and execution is the actual script itself, I can define the scenarios I want, the concurrency, the ramp up time, and the hold time. So I want to ramp up for just 1 minute and, 1 second, and hold for 1 minute. So going back to what I said, the need to be able to basically take the dynamic data and use it in an additional request, what I have here is something called a regular expression extractor. So going through the script from the top to the bottom, let's actually take a look at what we're doing here. So within the scenario, I do have the ability to define headers. These are dynamic headers, these are headers which are added to every single request. So here I can have the accept, user agent. These are exactly the same as you would be defined in whatever headers you want. I have think time. This is how long it's going to wait between every request. I have default address. So default address means basically what's the URL or the domain name port slash is it HTTP or HTTPS that I'm making for all my requests. And also I have retrieve resources false. This correlates with don't retrieve all the embedded resources. So within JMeter, I have the ability to define do or do I not want to retrieve embedded resources. I'm going to say no, don't retrieve the embedded resources. Then I have the request section. This shows me a list of all the different URLs. And as you'll notice, each URL has a dash in front of it. That's part of the YAML format. And then within each URL, I have a long list of parameters for that specific URL. So the first one is obviously the URL itself. The label, that's the name or the description that I'm giving to that request. And then I have optionally different parameters. So the first one that we're looking at here is something called extract regular expression. And what this does is it will pull from the response itself the data and look using a regular expression in order to store some data into a variable. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm defining a variable called auth token. I'm using this regular expression, crf token content equals, and this is where I actually have the data itself. The default, as you'll understand in a second, the default, I can either have something like no value here, but in this case, I'm saying if you didn't find an authentication token, just use a previous one you had beforehand. And then match number and template, you can usually use just 1 and 1 here. This is multiple matches. So what I'm doing here is I'm reading the home page, pulling out this regular expression to get the authentication token, which I'll use later on. Going on quickly through the list of the requests, and we'll dig down in them a bit more. Again, here I have another request for this URL. This is the label I'm using. Now you'll notice, for instance, here I have method equals post. So the default method is actually a get method, but if I want it to be a post method, then I'll put here method equals post, in which case I put the body. Here's a UTF, authenticity token, variant ID. These are a few parameters which I got when I was doing the recording himself. So how do we get these parameters, you might ask? Excellent question. So if I go here to the recording that I had in JMeter, I might look here. Let me actually bring this up. This was from the orders populate. So if I look at the recording under orders populate, here we go. I can see already that these parameters are what were passed in to the actual script itself. So I see I needed authenticity token, I need a button parameter, a quantity parameter, a UTF parameter, and a variant ID parameter. So these are the parameters, and then I can take these parameters, and here I put them within my Taurus YAML file. I also want a specific header, since this is a form application. This is a standard, basically doing a post, and so forth and so forth. So here again, I have a URL, label, method, body. Here's the auth token that I had from beforehand that I pulled out, etc., etc. Now, you'll notice, I just want to scroll down a little more. Most of this is pretty straightforward. Again, you have URL, method, body. Here, I have a few different regular expression extractors because there's actually 3 different values that I needed to pull out of the response. So I needed the authenticity token, but I also needed a billing address ID and a shipping address ID. And again, we can, in order to find these actual names, this was pulled from the checkout registration. If I go back to the original one, the original script, and checkout registration, here you can see again all the different parameters that I needed to pull out. Order email, etc. So in terms of getting the information you need, usually what you'll find is that if there's specific values which you need to get, in this case actually the checkout update addresses or the address, I needed to use the billing address ID and the shipping address ID. Here we go, billing address ID and shipping address ID. So I needed to pull them from the previous request. And again, using JMeter, you can usually see that if there's a request which has some dynamic data, it's usually the previous request that actually you can pull it from. Here is the actual address information. So all of this was taken using a recording of the exact same steps that we showed beforehand. Here again are the irregular expression extractors. Here is the authentication, the authenticity token, etc., etc. So far so good. And what I'm going to show you here, again at the bottom of the execution, is what this actually looks like when we want to start actually using this stuff. So this is all good. And what I'm going to do here we go, is in the command line, the Taurus command line is BZT, which stands for BlazeMeter Taurus. So I just do BZT. And I'm going to give it the name of the YAML file that I created beforehand. There we go. But I'm going to add one more parameter called -GUI. And the -GUI parameter, which is basically what you want to do for your debugging, it will convert, basically what the Taurus always does is it converts the YAML first of all into a JMeter script, but by using the -GUI parameter, what it will do is it will bring up a JMeter instance, load that JMX file, and wait for you to hit the start button before it actually starts the test. Let's go ahead and do that. There we go. So here's my JMeter instance. You'll notice that Taurus in the background is actually waiting for something because it's waiting for you to start the test in order to start interpreting the data, the results itself. So here I can see again, this is these correlate exactly. Let me actually bring it up. It'll be a little easier to see. These guys here correlate to what's here. So we start with the header section, and this is the same as the headers here. This header section correlates to the headers here. By default, it'll use cache and cookies. DNS Manager 2 it'll use by default, and any defaults which you might have added. In this case, the default address of using http store.blazdemo.com, you can see that goes to the defaults here. This is, I have to make this a little bigger so you can see it. This is some JMeter peculiarities for the interface. Here we go. You can see the server name store.blazdemo.com and the port number 3000. So what we've done basically is create the YAML file, and then Taurus will create the JMeter file for me with all those things which correlates. And here within the thread group, I have all the URLs. So for each URL, I can see this is home page. Here's the label. Here's the URL. Here's the label, tote bag detail page, etc., etc. And if I take an example, which is a post, here we have orders populate and label orders populate method equals post. We go to order populate here. You can see, indeed, this is a post request. And I can also take a look at all of the parameters within the post request of the body, the authenticity token, variant ID, etc. And I can see those are passed in exactly the same for the JMeter script. You can also see that each one of these has a think time, and this correlates to here the think time at the bottom, sorry, the think time here of 500 milliseconds. So we've also added a think time of 500 milliseconds to all my requests, and here, for example, is the regular expression extractor, which correlates here. If I go to the cart, here we go, to this regular expression extractor. Here is the name of the variable, auth token, the regular expression itself. You can see here on the left, and that correlates to the right. So what we've done is basically start up JMeter. It will load already for us the script, but I want to see the output because I want to do some debugging. So you'll notice that there's already a view results tree here, but it's disabled by default because it takes up a lot of resources. And just for debugging purposes, what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it on. That's Command T if you're on a Mac. And you'll notice here I have one user for 1 second. Sorry, one user overall, but instead of loop count forever, I'm going to actually have this just run once, just for debugging purposes. And I'll hit the start button within JMeter. And if I go to the view results tree, I can see all of my requests. So far, so good. Now this is the finalized script, so I know that it works, including the order confirmed. But let's say, for instance, you had an issue. Let's say you had a typo in your script and something was wrong. So if I go here and let's say at the very end, instead of auth token, I had here, instead of order, let's say instead of 3, this was a 4. I had a typo, or here the auth token, say auth token. Okay, I have a typo here. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to close this JMeter instance. And if I close the JMeter instance, it'll also automatically close the Taurus process. Let's go ahead and do that one more time. Again, it takes just a few seconds for it to create the script, load JMeter. Here we go. I'm going to go back, turn on the view results tree, hit play. I can see it's going through all the requests. You'll also notice, by the way, in the background that the console itself changed from just kind of looking at the log or the tail of the log to the actual Taurus console interface, which runs when you're running a test within Taurus. But you'll notice here the order confirmed all of a sudden is in red. Uh-oh, something happened. So I can, for the debugging purposes, I'm just going to hit the stop key here at the top. And if I look at response data, I want to change this to HTML. And I look at the order confirmed, I can see Action controller, invalid authenticity token. Okay, something definitely happened. So this is basically in terms of debugging, until your script is working perfectly, you'll probably want to run with a -GUI command line parameter so you can actually see what's happening, do the view results tree on, and once everything is working perfectly, that's when you'd actually be able to just run it without necessarily using the GUI. So let's go ahead and close this again. No, I don't want to save. You'll notice that Taurus the second that JMeter dies notices that JMeter died, so it's done as well. Let's go ahead one more time and this time fix it again. So it's an auth token. Let's hit save. And let's run it one more time. Here again, it's JMeter script. Again, view results tree. And hit play. Again, that's Command T on a Mac. I forget the shortcuts for other machines. But have the view results tree. Now, don't forget, you do not want to have view results tree on when you're actually doing a serious load because it uses up a lot of resources. And I would even say when you're doing a real test, you probably don't want the GUI at all. The GUI is just great for debugging, or if you want to make some kind of last-minute changes to the script before you actually run it, -GUI is extremely powerful. So here I can see everything seems to be working fine. And I'm going to go ahead and I can also look at the console. I can see there's only one user active. I have some high-level stats. So far, so good. I can even wait for it to kind of finish. Oh, one other thing you need to be aware of. If you do use the -GUI parameter, what will happen is that the test will indeed stop in about a minute. Let me wait a little more. If you checked out here in the actual thread group, you'll see there's a schedule and it was set to run for 60 seconds. So, okay, you can see the test stopped. There's 0 threads running, but JMeter is still running. And Taurus itself, the interface, won't end until JMeter itself dies. So at this point, even though the test is over in JMeter, I still need to close my JMeter interface. And only at that point will Taurus itself close down. So far so good. We saw how to create a test. We understood the concept of what we're doing in the YAML file is immediately generated on the fly into a JMeter script. We understand URLs, labels, how to pull data using regular expressions. But now let's actually look at a few other things that you probably want to do if you're actually writing your script. So one other thing which you probably want to do if you're writing your script, I'm going to look at this version actually at the bottom, is that you want to do some error checking. And error checking basically means I want to take a look at the result itself or at the response from the server and basically look for the existence of some string or some HTTP code. So within JMeter, we have something called, I can actually show you this here. I can do add, just a second, click on this. Add an assertion. And an assertion, there's different types of assertions. Assertions basically means I'm looking at something. I might be looking at the HTML assertion, duration assertion, etc., etc., etc. I'm going to look at the response assertion, which is, so the response assertion is one of the assertions that Taurus supports. And here you can see within the GUI, I can basically define certain attributes. The most common one is a specific pattern that which you want the response to actually contain. So in this case, what we did here, I'll show you how it's defined within the YAML file, is all I need to do is assert that the response contains this string, processed successfully. So again, this assertion is within this URL or within this request. So it's the last request to check out, update, confirm. Here is the rest of the stuff in terms of the method, the body, headers, etc. And then last but not least, I want for this specific request to make sure that it contains processed successfully. So to see what that looks like within the JMeter script itself, let's actually now run this updated version. Here we go. And if I look at the very last request, the order confirmed, assert has processed successfully. One other thing you'll notice in terms of Taurus is that it tries to use smart names for the elements. So it doesn't just call this assertion, it actually does it based on what it's looking here, processed successfully. This is what it looks like in JMeter. Let's go ahead and actually run this within JMeter. Look at the data. Oh, you know what? I just realized. So this is one of the cool things about using it with the GUI is if you made a mistake, for instance, I'm going to hit stop, turn the view results tree on, hit play again, and Taurus is still running in the background. So basically it allows you to dynamically even change your script or do stuff and still have all this great Taurus goodness as controlling it. And here's order confirmed. I'll get the response data. I want to look at this in HTML format. And here I can see your order has been processed successfully. Awesome. So this obviously worked, and there's an order ID. And this means that overall what we're doing so far is it works. So what we have now so far, just to recap in the script, is we have URLs which are being requested, we have the label, the method, the body, extra headers, we understand how to do assertions, which are checking if something worked or didn't work. We have regular expression extractor, which allows us to pull data from the response, save it in a variable like final order ID or authenticity token. Here's some more examples. I'm saving into a shipment ID variable, which I'm going to be using later. And there's one other thing which is very common though when I'm doing performance testing, and that's the need to take, instead of having everything hard-coded, I want to basically read data from a CSV file and have that populate my script so every user will be a different user. So what we've seen until now, I'm actually go ahead and stop this. You can also do Control-C within the Taurus interface. Just hit it once, and it'll also shut down very nicely. So when we did the original recording, it recorded just me as a user. And we can play back just me as a user and over again. But what would really be helpful is if we can take any of the data within the script and actually have that read from a CSV file. So what I did is I took this original file, and here where I have the attributes of this is my information. I created a version where I'm having all of my data, my email address, first name, last name, etc., all come from a CSV file. And the CSV file, all we need to do in terms of adding a CSV file to the script itself is add within the scenario itself an entry called Data Sources. Here I have the path. This is the name of the data source, user_data.csv, and quoted true. This simply means, can I use quotes in order to encapsulate the data since it's comma delimited? And if I have a comma, obviously I don't want it to mess up my data. So how does this correlate to the actual script itself? Let's take a quick look. Again, the easiest and fastest way to bring it up is literally just run it here from the command line. I'm going to get a new JMeter instance, bring it up, and now you'll notice this entry called CSV user_data.csv. So what does that look like? Within JMeter, this is called the CSV dataset config, but basically all you need to pass in is the name. You need to start the file name itself, user_data.csv. The delimiter is going to be always kind of comma. There's some other things which you could overwrite. The defaults are usually fine. But I want to point out for those of you who are JMeter users that the variable names here is empty. And the reason we do so is we're using the ability to have the variable names defined within the actual CSV itself. So if I do here file, open, and I'm going to use here we go, user data CSV. Here you'll note that the first line of the CSV file are the names of the variables themselves. So here I have email, first name, last name, address 1, address 2, city, country ID, state ID, etc. So these variable names are taken verbatim and used, or the names of the columns are taken verbatim and used as the variable names within the script. So if I go back to the YAML file and scroll down a bit, you'll see here first name, last name, etc. So just make sure that you're using the exact same names as the column headers, country ID, state ID, etc. So now when we actually look and run the script, instead of just having Ophir Prusak as the user, each line will be a new user. So again, if I go back here to the script itself, and if I hit view results tree, I'll turn that on, and I'll hit go. If I now look at the results, and let's take, for instance, I think even orders populate, you can start to see the email addresses. Here we go under registration. So this is some person's email address. I don't know exactly who that is. And if I go to the update address, you can see sorry, if you go here to registration, oh, it is this one. It's under delivery. So here you can see all the information which is being passed. Or you know, let's just do confirmation. Here we go. Here you can see the billing address which was used under confirmation. Here's the first name, last name, all the information. And if I go to the next order confirmed, I can see a different person. So voila, we are now using the data from the CSV file instead of using just hard-coded data. And in the same token, instead of just changing the data for the user, which is making the request, I could also have changed this to the product information, etc. Let me go ahead and stop this. I'll close JMeter. And again, here we have, it's done here. So what we've covered is the ability to take dynamic data, which is usually an authentication token or some other data which I need to pass in from the response to the next request by using regular expressions under the extract regex. Here's the name of it, and here is a regular expression to extract. I also have assertions, which is the ability to check a response to see if it contains a specific thread. You can also have assertions, by the way, to check HTTP codes or even how long it took for to respond. And I also have the ability to have data sources. Data sources means I can read in data from a file and then pass that into variables, which I'll use within my script. Now, the cool thing is when I actually was in the process of creating the script for today's webinar, I did start with that kind of skeleton within JMeter just to get the recording. But once I had that, all the rest of my debugging was done purely with the YAML file. And by having this in a YAML file, which is easily readable, obviously you can store this in a source control system. Anybody can go in, make changes. It's easy to understand what's going on. So now that we have and understand, okay, how do I create the script? What happens on the Taurus side of things? What's happening on the JMeter side of things? Let's also understand, well, how do I take all this information and actually start to get some real reporting data? Or how do I actually get value from this? So now let's looking at the reporting side of things. So what I'm going to do is go back to my interface. And This time, instead of GUI, I'm just going to leave off the -GUI and just run the script. Before I do so, the script here at the bottom is have it run for 3 people with a ramp up of 180 seconds and hold for 2 minutes, which means the entire test will actually run for about 5 minutes, where I have the first 3 minutes of a ramp up, and then the last 2 minutes it'll just hold at 3 users. Now, obviously, if I was doing a real world load test, I'd probably test with more than just 3 users, but the environment I'm testing on is a development environment, so it really can't handle that well a lot of users. Let's go ahead and just run this. So what's happening now behind the scenes is, again, the same process. It's converting my YAML file into a JMeter script. It's then running the JMeter script. It's looking at the output from the JMeter script in terms of the requests and the response times, and then on the fly converting it into this nice console-based GUI where I can get some high-level statistics about what's going on. So here I can see, for instance, how many users there are, how many hits. This is at 1 second intervals, average response times. And then here's the labels. I can see all the requests which have been made, how many hits, how many failures, errors. We have at the top the stats from the latest interval, which is defined for 1 second. So once a second, here's the stats just from the last 1 second of requests. And here, in the cumulative stats, here I get statistics for all the requests so far. I have overall, it's going to be about a 5-minute test, and I can see how long has elapsed and what the ETA is, and some info as well as the latest version that I'm running right now, 2.23 of Taurus. So all this is pretty cool. Here at the bottom left, by the way, this is a really cool real-time graph of the current response times. I can see initially it was pretty kind of flat. I'm already adding some users, and like I said, the environment I'm testing is not very powerful, so even 2 or 3 users, it's going to get a little slow. And I can see what's going on kind of a high level. So this is great for, I want to say, some just high level testing of what's going on. It's a little difficult to dig down into the data. It's more for kind of real time what's going on. It's great if you're doing baseline testing. So like, your environment should be okay at 50 users. You just made a code change, you want to test it, see what's happening here, or just kind of really high level of what's going on. But what Taurus lacks is really the ability to dig down deeper into the nitty gritty of what's going on in terms of the users. So if I really want to dig down deeper, in that case, we're going to use a feature that Taurus has, which is to pass the data in real time into BlazeMeter, totally for free, and use BlazeMeter's own reporting engine. So what I'm going to do is, instead of waiting this to finish, let's just hit Control-C. You can see it's shutting down. It also shows you some high-level information for the entire test, by the way, if you want to get. But what I really want to do now is take a look at that same test, but now get the really cool graphing features that BlazeMeter has. So I'm going to run it again. And if I use the -report option in the command line, let me make this a bit bigger. Here we go. So if I use the -report version in the command line, what it does is it will make a connection to BlazeMeter via our API and in real time push the data into BlazeMeter using our reporting engine. You can also use it -GUI if you want. You can use both -report, -GUI. Now let's go ahead and do that just so we can get see how cool you can do everything at once. So what we didn't see here in other windows, here's the GUI, which here's the JMeter interface, which just came up, and here is the BlazeMeter interface, which also came up. So you can see it's waiting for data. Let's go to the JMeter interface, and let's go ahead. I'm not going to have the view results tree on simply because that's a big resource hog. I'm just going to hit go. So now the test is being executed, and you can even see the interface. Again, I don't try this in terms of real live large amounts of load, simply because the GUI itself is a resource hog. But I just wanted to show you that you can do this, especially for debugging. And you can see in the BlazeMeter side of things, you can already see the data start to come in. So I'm going to click the Load Report tab and click on the seconds at the bottom. And now what I'm getting is all of the requests from my JMeter script, which was created by Taurus, being pushed into the BlazeMeter interface in real time. So I'm not going to go too much into the interface of the BlazeMeter reporting engine. I just will say a few high-level things. First of all, you can define what labels you want to view or not view. Plus, you can see here all the different labels. The default is to show them all. Let's also look at the home page and the confirmation page. So here we have 3 lines, one for the all, one for the home page, one for the confirmation page. Again, it's just one user. I don't have that much data, which is why the graph looks a little funky. But as the test continues, then it'll start to look a little more interesting. I also have here at the bottom left the different KPIs, response time, latency. And for longer tests especially, I can define if I want the data at a 1-second interval, 10-minute interval, or a 1-minute interval. I can look at averages, mins, and max, etc. Another cool thing I have in the BlazeMeter interface is the aggregate report, where I can also look at all the data in an Excel spreadsheet type format. So this is great if you kind of want to just get the high level, especially if you're doing a test where you're not increasing the load, but you're keeping it constant, let's say at 10 users, and you want to get a good idea of what response times are like. All of the column headers, by the way, are sortable. So I can see overall kind of what's the fastest or what's the slowest. Immediately I can see the order confirmation page is actually the slowest in terms of average response time, which is, again, not that surprising. So let me go back here. And of course, I can look at the Taurus GUI as well to see what's going on. So that's it in terms of the performance testing bootcamp. I know we covered a lot of stuff, and to be honest, the best way to kind of dig even deeper if you want to know more about Taurus itself is definitely to look at the Taurus documentation. We go here to the Taurus documentation. They have a lot of information about creating scenarios. If we go back to the docs here, just a second. Here we go, the documentation. We have installing command line, configuration files, execution settings, scenario building, reporting and processing, troubleshooting, etc., etc. So definitely check out the Taurus documentation itself if you want to know more. I hope today's example, which shows you how to create an end-to-end test complete with correlation of dynamic authentication tokens, CSV files, error checking with assertions. And by the way, this YAML file, as well as the user data file, will also be uploading so you guys can take a look at it yourselves if you want to understand a little more. Feel free to, by the way, play around with the store.blazedemo.com website. Keep in mind, it might be down if too many people are hitting it, but it's a website which we specifically created so people can play around with performance testing. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. Let me actually bring it back to here. I'm going to open up the questions. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the GoToWebinar control panel. As I said beforehand, we will be sending out the recording of the webinar to everybody a little later on. So starting with a question of defining think time. So think time, we went over that. You simply have within the script here at the top, think time. This think time is just a constant think time. You can do it in milliseconds, you can do it in seconds, in minutes. One of the cool things, by the way, within Taurus is when you're defining anything that has to do with a time frame, MS is milliseconds, S is seconds, M is minutes, H is hours. So you can just use whatever you want in terms of the different types of variables. In terms of page verifications, also there's a question. So we did show that with assertions here at the bottom, where you can do contains. And again, within the Taurus documentation, there's more detail there as well. So there's a question is, what's the difference between JMeter recording and the YAML file? So ultimately, if you want to actually record the user activity, you do need to do so in terms of using a tool like JMeter, which will store it as a JMX file. There's also other tools, obviously, which will allow you to record user activity. Ultimately, what you need to do is look at the actual HTTP requests which are being made, see if it's a post or a GET. If it's a post, you probably want to look at the body to see what the actual variables that are being sent, as well as any headers. And JMeter is simply an easy way to do that. Excellent question. Well, how do I convert JMeter into Taurus? So we're actually working on a JMeter to Taurus converter, which should be out soon. I don't have a time frame for you, but especially if you're using JMeter to actually create the recording in the first place, and it's a simple recording which is done with just the recording, we're working on a tool which will allow you to do that. That should be out soon. If you go to, by the way, the Taurus website, let me bring that up really quick. And here, under the Taurus website, and you go here to the support forum. So we have a pretty active support forum with people asking questions and answers or bug reports, etc. If you put here under this, if you basically subscribe to the support forum, you can definitely find out when new features, major features are released, etc. Whenever there's a change log, etc., we'll put this here in the support forum. So that's definitely the place you want to go if you want to see new topics and new stuff going on in the support forum. So going on to the questions, can you enter a synchronization timer in the YAML file? So I see quite a few questions about, well, can I do this in the YAML file, or can I do that in the YAML file? I would have to say, first of all, we're constantly adding new features and functionality in terms of being able to go from the YAML file to the JMeter file. Obviously, it doesn't cover 100%, which means there are some features and functionalities within JMeter which aren't currently covered in the YAML file. But I can tell you from my current experience that I would say 90% of the user case scenarios are definitely covered in the YAML file. And the cool thing is, even if they're not, you can still use Taurus to actually execute an existing JMeter file. You'll still get all the goodness of the real-time reporting. All you have to do is, let me actually show you this here. For those of you who are JMeter people, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Here we go. And let's take a look and see what we have here. So we have some, here we go. So let's look at this one. Here is a JMeter file which I created a bit back. I can also do BZT and just pass in a existing, here we go. And I can do minus GUI, minus report. Let's do minus report even, yeah? And what this does is, instead of taking a YAML file, it simply takes an existing JMeter file and runs it. So you can definitely use an existing JMeter file, and again, you get all the goodness of the nice Taurus interface, as well as the goodness of the BlazeMeter interface. Here we go. And over time, we will be adding more and more features to the YAML format to be able to support them within JMeter. So here's a question. If you don't want the assertions to be named automatically, is there a way to do so? That's actually a good question. I'm not sure about that. I'll have to get back to you in terms of naming the assertion opposed to them being named automatically. I think there is a way. I'm not sure, but I'll need to get back to you. There's another question of, what does the minus before the block indicate? So that's an excellent question. The minus is a standard YAML type of entity. If you do a quick search on Google on just the YML format or YAML format, in terms of if you have multiple entities, this is basically an array. But if you have multiple entities, it's a minus. To be honest, I myself don't always remember the details of everything, but I know before multiple URLs, you do have a minus. If you check out the Google, it's a Wikipedia entry on YAML, it'll explain to you exactly when, the whole thing with indentations. You'll notice here there's indentation. This is basically a structure, the minus and the indentations, in order to define different entities. It's similar to JSON kind of, but here you just do it with minuses and indentations. So somebody asked, what about, okay, unique parameters per user that we already talked about with the CSV. There's another question. Okay, is the question about using within CSV files in JMeter, if I leave out the names of the columns within JMeter, but just put it in the CSV file, is that new in JMeter 2.13? No, that's actually been there for a while. So here's an excellent question. What about logic controllers? So just going back really quick to JMeter, let me actually show you here within JMeter. This is JMeter. As you'll notice, if I go here and add, there's a ton of different stuff I can do here in terms of adding different types of config elements and logic controllers, etc., etc. I'm just gonna do a thread group really quick and do here, add, and I'll do a logic controller. So there's lots of different stuff you can do within JMeter that currently we don't have the ability within YML files. But I will say, and one thing which I didn't show today, and we can definitely share that in a future session, is you can also mix and match entities from a YML file and a JMeter file. So what I could do, for instance, I could have a JMX file, which has some stuff which can only be supported in JMeter, and I can have additional entities in a YML file, and then Taurus, you can actually pass in the command file, run this YML file and this JMeter file together, and it will merge them to a single JMeter file. And that's a great way to basically either add additional capabilities to your JMeter script, or optionally, you can override just about any parameter you have within your JMeter script from the YML file. So that's just a bit beyond today's session, but we do have that capabilities. Okay, so excellent question. Well, what about capturing the CPU utilization or memory of the server which is being hit? So that's an excellent question. That's not something which Taurus does. Taurus wasn't meant to actually replace your application performance monitoring solution. BlazeMeter does have integration with third parties, such as New Relic or Dynatrace or CloudWatch, but ultimately that's kind of up to the user in terms of integration with backend, what's happening. Okay, so there's another question here about, well, what if I have multiple thread groups within JMeter scripts? So what I didn't show you here is here at the bottom, I have here execution scenario checkout. Now, this is just a single scenario that I've defined here is in checkout, but under scenarios, I can actually have multiple scenarios and then have here under execution, I can define all the different scenarios together. And I can have for each scenario different concurrency of number of users, ramp-ups, etc. So if I actually go back here to the documentation for Taurus, and I go under scenario building, I think there's an example here where they actually show you, here we go. So this is get request and the name of it, get request. But, well, maybe it's not shown here. But you do have the ability to define multiple scenarios, and then at the bottom within your YML script, you can simply have scenario, A, then scenario B, scenario C, etc. Excellent question about JMeter plugins. Okay, so one of the things which I didn't show you here is that if you are using Taurus and you don't want to use the out-of-the-box JMeter configuration, or if you have some special needs for your JMeter instance in terms of, like I said, plugins or maybe something else, you can tell Taurus at the command line or even within the files not to use the built-in JMeter instance, but to use the own JMeter instance which you want. So Taurus will go and install JMeter on its own on your box, so you don't need to install it. It takes care of all that when you install it. But to your point, you might have some JMeter specifics. So I don't remember offhand, but I do remember if you go here, I think it's under the execution settings, if I remember correctly. Here we go. So JMeter location auto installation. So basically by default, it will look for its own instance, but you can also tell it this is where you should actually be using for, or should actually be using for the JMeter instance. So don't use the JMeter instance which is built in. I want you to use a different JMeter instance which you already have installed. So that's how you would utilize basically JMeter plugins. There's a question about ramp up and ramp down, or using some of JMeter's plugins for thread groups. So we do plan on supporting that soon. At the moment, we only support the built-in thread groups, which means kind of a really simple ramp up. But in the near future, we do plan on supporting also the ultimate thread groups, which allows you to have a much more detailed configuration of ramping up and ramping down. Somebody asked, is BlazeMeter open source? No, BlazeMeter itself is not open source. BlazeMeter is a commercial service which allows you to run, for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll just show you really quickly. If I go to blazemeter.com, we're a commercial service that basically allows you to use existing JMeter scripts and run them in the cloud. With cool reporting features and integrations, etc. Now, we created Taurus as an open source project because we wanted to make it easier for everybody to use JMeter. But the reporting features that you saw, as well as the ability to run, huge loads from the cloud, that's part of our commercial service. But we also do have a free account if you just want to play with BlazeMeter as a developer. So going on to some of the questions. Can you use multiple load generators? Yes. There is a way within JMeter as well as within Taurus to use multiple load generators. That's a bit beyond the scope of today's session. It is possible if you go to the Taurus forum and you ask, we can send you a link on how to do that. Somebody asks, can you add randomization and or spire during Taurus test? You definitely can. And this is actually something which I, for lack of time, didn't do today, but it's something which can definitely be done. And in order to do that, the easiest way is the regular expression extractor. You can actually have the ability, and let me actually show you here, the regular expression extractor. So let's say you have a category page on your website, and you have 20 different items, and you want your script to just randomly choose one of the items. Assuming that there's some regular expression like item ID or something like that, instead of doing the match number 1, if you use 0, it will pull a random one of the matches from the regular expression, and then you could use that as your variable. So at this point, there's a lot of great questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer them all. I do have to go. But like I said, I will definitely, first of all, send everybody a recording of today's session. Most importantly, if you want, definitely go, these are all excellent questions. Go to the support forum here. Go to Taurus, and under the support forum, ask your questions, and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible in terms of how to do it with Taurus. So again, thanks everyone for joining today's session, and have a great day.